Welcome in, everybody. Ready for another deep dive. This one takes us back to 1912, to Villisca, Iowa. Small town America, you know the kind of place, right? Life moves a little slower. Everyone knows their neighbors.
Peaceful, idyllic, until it isn't. And that's what makes the Villisca Axe Murders so fascinating and so disturbing. This stark contrast between the image of small-town America and this brutal crime.
Yeah, it's like something out of a horror movie. This darkness descending on a seemingly innocent place. And right at the center of it all, we have this family, the Moores, Josiah and Sarah, and their 4 kids, Herman, Catherine, Boyd, and little Paul. Totally ordinary family, hardworking, church-going folks.
Active in the community, by all accounts.
Exactly. But their story, along with the story of 2 young girls who were visiting, Lena and Ina Stillinger, ends on a hot June night, brutally murdered with an axe, and to this day, the case remains unsolved.
It's incredible, isn't it? Even with the limited forensic technology of the time, this case offers a glimpse into life in the early 20th century. The fears, the social dynamics, even the challenges of investigating such a horrific crime.
So we've got eyewitness accounts, we've got crime scene details, and we've got a long list of suspects. Our mission, should we choose to accept it, is to try and figure out what happened that night in Villisca. You up for the challenge?
I'll do my best to guide us through the evidence. We'll see if we can connect the dots, maybe even debunk a few theories along the way. Hopefully, by the end of all this, we'll understand this mystery a little bit better.
All right, let's do it. Picture this. Sunday, June 9th, 1912. It's Children's Day in Villisca. Everything seems normal. The Moore family goes to church. They have Sunday dinner.
Pretty typical, right?
Like any other Sunday.
Exactly. Except they've got these 2 guests, the Stillinger sisters, Lena and Ina. They were invited over to spend the night and join in Children's Day festivities.
You know, the detail about the Stillinger sisters is really interesting to me. It's like, just adds another layer to this whole thing. Does it change the killer's motive? Were they targets all along, or were they just tragically in the wrong place at the wrong time? That's a great question. Did the killer even know they'd be there? It adds a whole other level of complexity to this case, that's for sure. Anyway, the family has dinner. Kids probably head to bed early. It's a school night, after all. And that's the last anyone sees them alive.
And that's when the sense of normalcy, the everyday routine, gets totally shattered. The next morning, Monday morning, everything is off.
Yeah, it's like a switch flipped overnight. Everything's quiet at the Moore house. Too quiet. Josiah's out doing his chores. The kids aren't off to school. Nobody's even raised the flag. And this is enough to really worry their neighbor, Mary Peckham, who lived right next door.
Mary's role is so crucial here. It's her concern, her instinct that something's not right, that sets the whole investigation in motion. Classic small-town scenario. You know everyone knows each other's routines.
Totally. So Mary goes over to check on them, knocking, calling out their names. Nothing. The doors are locked, which is unusual for the Moores. So Mary, she's getting really worried now. She calls over Josiah's brother, Ross Moore, to help her figure out what's going on. They try everything, peeking through windows, knocking again, still nothing. Finally, Ross forces open a window, climbs inside, and that's when the horror of it all is revealed.
I can't even imagine going from just checking in on your neighbors to that, the shock, the terror, and then, of course, that news spreading through town. It's a lot to process.
It's truly awful.
Yeah.
Inside, Ross finds Josiah and Sarah in their bed, dead, brutally murdered. And as the town marshal and the doctor arrives, they start to search the house, and they find the 4 more children dead in their beds upstairs. And downstairs, in the guest room, Lena and Ina Stillinger, also dead. 8 victims, all bludgeoned to death, likely with an axe. The level of violence, it's unimaginable.
And it's the sheer number of victims, along with the just brutal nature of the attack, that makes this case so disturbing. This wasn't just some random act of violence. This was something else entirely. Methodical, cold, almost beyond comprehension.
Absolutely. And before we go any further, I think it's important to acknowledge each of the victims by name. Josiah, Sarah, Herman, Catherine, Boyd, Paul, Lena, and Ina. Their lives were cut far too short. And amidst all the mystery and the speculation, we have to remember that these were real people, people with families, people with futures.
It's easy to get caught up in the puzzle, the whodunit aspect, but we can't forget the human cost of this tragedy. These were 8 individuals whose lives were stolen.
Let's move on to the crime scene itself, and I have to warn you, some of the details are pretty disturbing. One of the first things investigators noticed was that every mirror in the house was covered with cloth. Even the glass panes of the doors were covered. What do you make of that?
It's a strange detail, isn't it? Remember, we're talking 1912 here. Superstitions were a lot more common back then. Covering mirrors was supposed to prevent the spirits of the dead from getting trapped. But it could also be a sign of the killer's own anxieties, not wanting to see their reflection while committing such a horrific act. What do you think?
It's creepy, that's for sure. Superstition, a guilty conscience, or even just a calculated attempt to mislead the investigation. It's really hard to say for sure. What other details stood out to you?
Well, there's the uncooked bacon. A pan of it was just sitting there on the stove. Did the killer get interrupted? Were they planning to stick around after? It raises a lot of questions.
It's like a scene out of a horror movie, right?
Yeah.
The killer just casually cooking breakfast in this house full of Renault seats, chilling. What about fingerprints? Footprints? They also found something like that.
Oh, they found footprints, all right. Plenty of them. But remember, this is 1912. Forensic science was in its very early stages. Matching those prints to anyone, especially as so many people coming in and out of the house after the discovery, was practically impossible. And fingerprints. They barely had a concept of that as evidence back then. I bet it's frustrating for modern-day investigators looking back at this case.
I can only imagine. So they've got this gruesome crime scene, a million questions and very few answers. Where did they even begin to look for the killer?
Well, like you might expect, the investigation started with the people closest to the victims, and that's where we first meet Frank F. Jones, a man with a possible motive and a not-so-solid alibi.
Ah, now we're getting to the suspects. Tell me more about this Frank Jones. Who was he and why was he a suspect?
Frank Jones was a businessman, pretty prominent in Villisca. He and Josiah Moore, they were actually former business partners, both in the farm implement industry.
So maybe a business deal gone bad. That's always a classic motive in a murder mystery.
Right. But it seems their relationship was complicated, more than just a simple rivalry. Some sources say that Jones was incredibly jealous of Moore's success. Others say they had a falling out and it got personal. Either way, there's definitely bad blood between them.
Okay, so we've got motive. What about opportunity? Did Jones have an alibi for the night of the murders?
His alibi was that he was at home, alone, asleep. But as you can imagine, that wasn't the strongest alibi, even back then.
So we've got motive, a shaky alibi. This Jones guy is starting to look like a pretty good suspect. What happened next? Did they arrest him?
Not right away. Remember, things were different back then, legally speaking. They convened a grand jury to look into his possible involvement. Now, a grand jury isn't a trial. It's more like a preliminary hearing to decide if there's enough evidence to formally charge someone with a crime. And in Jones's case, they decided there wasn't enough to indict him.
Wait, so he just walked free?
Yeah.
Just like that?
Well, not exactly. He wasn't indicted, meaning he wasn't formally charged. But not being indicted doesn't equal innocence. The suspicion surrounding him never really went away, especially in a small town like Villisca.
So while he might have been legally in the clear, he was still living under this cloud of suspicion. Makes you wonder how that impacted his life, you know, even if he wasn't the killer. But before we go too deep into Frank Jones, there's another suspect who pops up, and his presence in Villisca that weekend is almost too strange to be a coincidence. We're talking about a traveling preacher, Reverend Lynn George Jacqueline Kelly.
And that's where things take a truly bizarre turn.
A traveling preacher. Okay, that's definitely interesting. What's the story with this Reverend Kelly?
Well, this Reverend Kelly just happened to be in Villisca on the very same weekend as the murders. He was there to preach, actually, at the Children's Day service at the Presbyterian Church.
Hold on, the Moores were Methodist, right? What was he doing at a different church?
That's right. The Moores were Methodist. But in a small town like Villisca, it wasn't that unusual for folks to attend special events at other churches. So it's entirely possible that the Moores, or at least some of them, were at that very service where Reverend Kelly was preaching.
Okay, yeah, that does make it a little creepier. This preacher, potentially preaching to the same people who would be murdered just hours later. Do we know anything else about this guy?
Here's where things get really weird. Reverend Kelly left town early Monday morning, the same day the bodies were discovered. Now, on its own, that's not necessarily suspicious, right? He was a traveling preacher, after all. It's his behavior after leaving Villisca that really raised some eyebrows.
What do you mean? What did he do?
Well, there are several sources that describe him becoming incredibly agitated and nervous after the murders. Some folks said he was fidgety, jumpy, even paranoid. He allegedly gave conflicting statements about his whereabouts that Sunday night. And there were even claims that he made these cryptic remarks, almost like he was hinting at his guilt.
Okay, so we've got a traveling preacher who just happens to be in town during the murders, takes off right after the bodies are found, and then starts acting all suspicious. I mean, I could see why the investigators would be focusing on him.
Right. It definitely fits the profile, right? Suspicious behavior. And it gets even stranger. Years later, rumors started circulating that Kelly had confessed to the murders. And not just once, but multiple times. He allegedly confessed to a fellow inmate while in prison for a completely unrelated crime. And there were even claims that he'd hinted at his guilt when he was being questioned by the police right after the murders.
Multiple confessions. That seems pretty damning, right?
You'd think so, wouldn't you? But here's the catch. Kelly later recanted all of those confessions. He claimed he had been coerced or misunderstood.
Hold on. He admitted to killing 8 people with an axe and then just took it back. What was he thinking?
It's definitely a head-scratcher. Was he genuinely guilty and then just, I don't know, overcome with remorse? Or was he mentally unstable, prone to making false confessions? Was he playing some kind of twisted game with the investigators? It's impossible to know for sure.
I'm really curious about those confessions. Were there any details that matched the crime scene? Anything that could actually link him to the murders?
Unfortunately, no. Just like with Frank Jones, there wasn't any physical evidence that definitively connected Kelly to the murders. And you have to remember, this was 1912. Forensic science was in its infancy. No DNA testing, no sophisticated fingerprint analysis. I mean, it makes you wonder what modern investigators could do with a case like this.
That's a good point. With today's technology, they might have found something that could have proved his guilt or cleared his name for good. But back then, they were working with practically nothing. So what happened to Reverend Kelly? Did they ever actually arrest him?
They did. In 1914, about 2 years after the murders, Kelly was arrested and charged with the murders of the Moore family and the Stillinger sisters. The trial was a huge deal, a lot of media attention. Everyone was following it. The prosecution laid out their case, focusing on Kelly's strange behavior, the alleged confessions, and of course the fact that he is in Villisca that weekend.
It sounds like it was straight out of a courtroom drama. What did the defense argue?
Well, the defense focused on the lack of physical evidence linking Kelly to the crime. They really hammered on that point. They argued that the prosecution was relying too much on circumstantial evidence and hearsay. They basically said the confessions were unreliable, maybe even coerced. They really tried to paint a picture of him as a troubled man, prone to making things up.
A classic legal battle, right?
Yeah.
The prosecution trying to build their case based on his actions and his words, and the defense trying to poke holes in their evidence, question his mental state. So what was the verdict?
After a long trial and a lot of deliberation, the jury found Reverend Kelly not guilty.
Not guilty. Seriously. After all that, he walked free again.
He did. But even though he was legally acquitted, that cloud of suspicion never really went away. He had a hard time finding work as a preacher, and the Villisca Axe Murders, they followed him for the rest of his life.
That's kind of sad in a way.
Yeah.
Even if he was innocent, his life was forever linked to this horrific event. But let's be honest, even if he was the killer, it seems like there's got to be more to the story, right? What about those other axe murders that were happening around the same time?
You're talking about the traveling axe murderer theory. And yeah, it's one of the most intriguing aspects of this whole case. You see, around the time of the Villisca murders, there were actually a string of unsolved axe murders across the Midwest. Similar families targeted, similar levels of brutality, all within a few years of each other.
So it's possible that the Villisca murders were just one stop on this killer's, gruesome road trip. That's terrifying. Did they ever manage to connect any of these cases? Find any solid evidence linking them together?
That's the frustrating part. They didn't. Investigative techniques back then were, limited. Sharing information between different police departments wasn't easy, and there was no national database for tracking crimes. So while there were definitely similarities, the possibility of a traveling axe murderer remains just that, a possibility, a theory.
So we've got Frank Jones, the jealous business rival, Reverend Kelly, the creepy preacher with a thing for confessing, and then this whole idea of a serial killer targeting families across the Midwest. This case is giving me a headache. Are there any other suspects or theories we should be thinking about?
Well, there's William Mansfield, who was briefly a suspect. He did have a history of violence, and he had committed similar axe murders around the same time. Some researchers even believe that he might be responsible for some of those other Midwest axe murders that we talked about. But like with the others, there's no solid evidence connecting him to Villisca. And then there's the whole traveling tramp theory.
A traveling tramp, what's that about?
Well, back then it was pretty common to blame crimes on homeless people or transient folks passing through town, especially if those crimes seemed motiveless or difficult to solve. Blame the outsider, it's a tale as old as time, really. But in the case of Villisca, it just doesn't hold much weight. There's nothing to suggest a tramp was even in the area that night, let alone any evidence connecting them to the crime.
So it seems like we have a lot of theories, but no real answers. This is why the Villisca Axe murders continue to fascinate people, right? It's a real-life whodunit with no satisfying ending. The ultimate unsolved mystery.
Exactly. It's a case that really captures the imagination, makes you question human nature, the nature of good and evil. It forces us to confront the darkness that can exist in even the most seemingly peaceful places.
Speaking of places, what about the Moore House itself? I've heard it's still standing.
It is, and it's become a bit of a legend in its own right. Some people say it's haunted by the spirits of the victims. There are all these reports of visitors experiencing strange phenomena, noises, cold spots, even apparitions.
Whoa, hold on. A haunted house? That's creepy. Tell me more.
Well, since the murders, the house has changed hands many times. It's been a private residence, a museum, even a boarding house for a while. And throughout its history, people have reported all sorts of strange and unsettling things going on inside. Footsteps, children's voices, doors slamming shut on their own, all kinds of stuff.
That's wild, like something straight out of a horror movie. Do you believe in ghosts? Do you think the Moore House is really haunted?
I tend to look for a rational explanation. Old houses creak and groan, drafts can slam doors, and the power of suggestion can be very strong, especially in a place with such a dark history. But I can't deny that there's something undeniably eerie about the Moore House. Maybe it's the weight of what happened there, maybe it's the unanswered questions.
I know what you mean. It's hard to imagine such a horrific event happening and then life just moving on. It's like the house itself absorbed the trauma, the mystery. No wonder people feel a sense of unease there.
It's a reminder that some events, some crimes, they leave an indelible mark. Not just on the people involved, but on the very places where they happened.
Well, we've covered a lot of ground in this deep dive, but now it's time to turn it over to you, our listener. What are your thoughts on all of this? Who do you think was responsible for the Villisca Axe murders? Was it Frank Jones? Reverend Kelly? That traveling killer? Or someone else entirely?
It's important to remember that despite all the theories, all the speculation, this remains an unsolved mystery. We've examined the evidence, we've explored the suspects, we've considered the possibilities, but ultimately the truth of what happened that night in Villisca might never be fully known.
It's a chilling thought, isn't it? That 8 lives could be taken so brutally and the killer just vanishes. It does feel like something out of a nightmare.
Yeah.
But it's also a reminder, that sometimes the most unsettling mysteries are the ones that stay with us, the ones that force us to really grapple with the darkness that exists in the world.
And maybe, just maybe, someday, someone will uncover that one crucial piece of evidence, that missing link that finally solves the puzzle of the Villisca Axe murders. But until then, we're left to just ponder the possibilities.
It's pretty amazing that after all this time, this case, the Villisca Axe murders, it still fascinates people. It's more than just a true crime story. It's a glimpse into this specific time and place, a study of human nature. It reminds us that even in those quiet corners of America, darkness can really take hold.
Yeah, and what's really interesting to me is how this case still resonates with people over a century later. I mean, it's inspired so many books, documentaries, even paranormal investigations. Why do you think that is? What is it about this case that just grabs our attention?
Well, I think it's that combination of things we've been talking about. The brutality of the crime, the mystery surrounding it, the fact that it happened in such an unexpected setting. It's like a real-life horror movie. And there's just something about those stories that pulls us in, even though they might make us feel a little bit uneasy.
Yeah, and let's not forget about the human element. I mean, we can relate to this family, the Moores, their everyday lives, their hopes and dreams, knowing that all that was just shattered so violently, so randomly. It adds this layer of tragedy that's hard to shake off.
You're right. It's really hard not to feel for the victims.
Yeah.
And the fact that it's unsolved just makes it even more captivating, right? It's like this puzzle we can't help but try to solve, even if we know the pieces might never quite fit together perfectly.
It reminds us that sometimes there are no easy answers in life. And, maybe that's okay. Maybe it's the searching for those answers, the grappling with the mystery that keeps the story alive and keeps these victims from being forgotten.
So where does that leave us? We've explored the crime scene, the suspects, all those theories, even the ghost stories. But the Villisca Axe murders remain an enigma, like a puzzle with missing pieces.
And even without a definitive answer, I think this deep dive has given us a new appreciation for how complex this case really is. A case that raises more questions than it answers.
It certainly has for me. And, Something that keeps coming back to me is that axe, the one they found at the scene. It belonged to Josiah, right? So does that mean the killer came into the house unarmed and then just grabbed the axe once they were inside? Or did they bring their own weapon and then just, for some reason, left it behind? It's a small detail, but it makes you wonder about the killer. What were they thinking? What was their plan?
That's a great point. It's those little details that can sometimes be the key to unlocking a mystery, you know? It's like trying to get inside the killer's head. Were they impulsive, methodical? Did they panic? Was there a reason they chose that particular weapon? Or was it just a crime of opportunity?
And then there's the question of the Stillinger sisters. If the killer knew they were going to be there, does that mean they were the real targets all along? Or were they just collateral damage,
Yeah.
caught in the crossfire of a bigger plan?
Yeah, the Stillinger sisters, they really add a whole other dimension to this case, don't they? I mean, if they were the intended victims, then what was the motive? What connection did they have to the killer? But if they weren't, then why kill them at all? Was it to eliminate witnesses? Or was it something even darker?
So many questions and
Yeah.
still no answers. It makes you wonder if we'll ever really know what happened that night.
But you know, that's the beauty of a deep dive like this, right? We're not just passively taking in information, we're engaging with it, questioning it, trying to analyze it. We're forming our own opinions, our own interpretations. And in doing that, we're coming to a deeper understanding, not just of this specific case, but of the historical context, the challenges investigators faced, and the impact of a tragedy like this.
It's true. Learning about this case has been, well, it's been both fascinating and really unsettling. It's a good reminder that even in the places we think of as safe, darkness can still find a way in, and sometimes those dark truths stay hidden.
And that, I think, is the biggest lesson of the Villisca Axe Murders, a case that challenges our assumptions, makes us curious, and reminds us that some mysteries, well, they may never be completely solved.
Well said. And on that note, I want to thank you, our listener, for joining us on this journey into the heart of a mystery that continues to fascinate and, well, haunt us more than a century later. We hope this deep dive has given you a fresh perspective on the Villisca Axe Murders. And maybe, just maybe, it sparked a little of that curiosity, that need to keep searching for answers.
Until next time, keep exploring, keep asking those tough questions. And remember, sometimes the most interesting stories are the ones that leave us wanting more, the ones that leave us searching.